You're now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. This podcast episode was tucked right under your Christmas tree just in time for the holidays. My gift to you as we prepare to celebrate the holiday season, but also to reflect on the year that has passed. As you reflect on what went well and what did not, always remember that now is one of the best times to take lessons learned so that as 2021 approaches, we will be more prepared to face the many challenges that may come our way. And since many of you will be reassessing what you eat, who better to have than a dietitian to provide a little inspiration and insights as she shares her dietary approaches with us today. My guest is Michelle Hurn. Michelle Hurn, with her easy to understand social media name at Run, Eat, Meet, Repeat, which is really clever, is a dietitian and ultra runner. Michelle was formerly a high carb distance runner like our friend in South Africa, Tim Noakes, and is now improving performance and reducing her anxiety by prioritizing protein. I think that's exactly what Tim started to do as well. She will be releasing a book soon entitled The Dietitian's Dilemma, where she asks all of us to consider a low-carb, high-fat eating plan. So, Michelle, I want to welcome you to Protecting Your Nest, and I want to ask you, how's things going for you today?
Hey, Dr. Hampton, thank you so much for having me on. Things are great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're awesome. You told me as we were getting ready to get started, you ran. I know you're a runner, so you started your day running. I'm like, I started my day just waking up and drinking water and some black coffee, but that's kind of cool that you start your day that way. I am curious. I know I'm in Chicago and there's about a 2-hour time difference. So, tell me a little bit about where you live and how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live right outside of Portland, Oregon, in Vancouver, Washington. So I'm actually originally from Texas. I'm originally from right outside the Dallas area. I grew up in Plano, Texas. And anyone who's from the South, it's very hot and very humid in the summers. And so certainly as I grew up and I got into distance running, I really wanted to go somewhere where the climate was a little more conducive to running, a little less hot and humid. And I actually had the opportunity to spend a summer in Boulder, Colorado. And I just fell in love with Colorado. That's where I thought I was going to move and live forever. But then I had the opportunity to visit Portland, Oregon. And we have a network of trails called Forest Park. I think it's the largest trail series, like within a city. Like you literally can go from being downtown city and drive 10 minutes to just miles and miles, over 20 miles of trails. And then I was hooked. So I knew as soon as I could, I wanted to get out here.
Yeah, the world is a beautiful place. My oldest son, Brandon, who has his own podcast, he just came back from Seattle. And I think when you live in Illinois, which is a plain state, every other place seems beautiful because it's just, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have our corn and all of that stuff that we grow here, but it's nice to see the world. It's a beautiful world. And I think when you factor in what you're saying, I want to be able to run. I actually did some cross country in high school at Lane Tech High School. So I remember doing that. And it definitely is a mental thing and I was always surprised when I was able to actually accomplish those long runs. It's just a mental battle. So, but I know you're not alone. I know you're not alone there. You have a wife. And when I interviewed Dr. Jen Unwin in England about how she met Dr. David Unwin, I asked her to tell her love story, how she actually got connected with him. And so I want to do the same to you. I want to ask you, how did you meet your wonderful wife?
Yeah, that's really sweet. Nobody's really ever asked me that, how Karine and I met. My wife's name is Karine Aaliyah. And, when I moved to Portland, I didn't really know anybody. I came out here, actually finished my dietetics degree. I did the last half of it online. So I did that out here in Portland. And I just started, kind of going out trying to meet people. I ended up meeting this really great group of friends. And Corrine she was in the group of friends. And I remember just loving being around her. Like, actually, I believe we met when I was 23. I'm 37 now. And even years later, we kind of laugh about, like, if our friends were getting together, I would kind of ask, like, hey, is Corrine going to be there? And she apparently would ask, like, oh, hey, is Michelle going to be there? And I just love spending time with her. I think I was so young. I wasn't sure if we were going to date, but, so I
Yeah,
wasn't trying to, when you're trying to impress somebody, you kind of put up a front, but I just
that's
felt
right.
so at ease. Like, I could just totally be myself, and I could share my dreams with her, like telling her at that time wanting to qualify for the Olympic trials. And, at that time I was finishing up school. So I want to be a dietitian and this is what I want to do. And I just loved being around her, right? And obviously, as time went on, we fell in love. We got married in 2016, and she's my biggest fan. She's never missed a race. She's encourages me. She's brilliant too. She's a scientist, and I love that she pushes me. She challenges me, but she's
Yeah.
also my best friend. So I'm incredibly lucky.
Yeah. First of all, spell her name for me.
Oh, Corrine. So it's Corene.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I love that name. I think it's a great name. But I also like that she's a scientist because I think kind of what got a lot of us into this way of eating, whether it's low carb, keto, carnivore, we became critical thinkers.
Yes.
And if you're a critical thinker, you may make mistakes periodically, but man, you'll be so much more prepared to make better decisions about the things that you have to decide about. So I'm glad she's there by your side. And I just was curious. So Dr. Jen Unwin will be a little jealous now that you'll be the second person I've asked about the story. So if she hears this podcast, she'll be able to tell me about that later. So, but I do want to, speaking of previous guests, because she was a previous guest, like some of my previous guests, like Dr. Kristen Bear and Dr. Kim Berry and A-Day Fox, the Black Carnivore, and of course, Amber O'Hearn, you are using your social media presence, things like podcasts and your upcoming book to help build a strong foundation for many who are, trying to figure out this low carb, keto, and carnivore path. So, what gaps do you plan to fill as you share your message of healing?
Yeah. So, my personal story of healing is, I think, it's unique potentially, and maybe not as much, but, I had such a serious eating disorder when I was very young. I was 12 years old, almost 5 feet tall, and weighed 57 and a half pounds. So, for people who are science minded, my BMI was 11.7. I was having heart arrhythmias, kidney failure, severely underweight, hair falling out. Like, basically my body was shutting down. And so I was, put in inpatient treatment for 60 days. And so, kind of talking about what that's like. I'd always thought I'd potentially write a book just talking about that. Like, what is it like to have anorexia, have a very serious eating disorder? Because I read a lot of books about it, as I grew up and went through adolescence and to adulthood. And I always kind of thought that I wasn't quite sure that any book I had read really captured the depths of despair, what it's like to be in a eating disorder. And I think there's a lot of parallels with eating disorders and addictions and other, like, very serious illnesses, even mental illnesses. So I hope that people can read it, and if you or a loved one or someone is struggling with that, you can relate. Like, you can say, oh my gosh, I've been there. This is, I can empathize with that. And then
Yeah.
I also wanted to, talk about the dilemma that a lot of healthcare professionals, we're seeing it obviously, individuals like you and Amber O'Hearn and Dr. Robert Sywis are having, and the dilemma that dietitians are having. I mean, my book is it's called The Dietitian's Dilemma.
That's
What do
right.
we do when we find out and we discover how incredibly powerful a low carbohydrate, high fat diet is, yet our guidelines do not allow us to teach this to patients? So I wanted to talk about my personal dilemma, and I wanted to go through my 11 years experience as a dietitian and talk about different conditions. My book goes through diabetes, eating disorders, mental disorders, including major depression and anxiety, sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting, and heart disease. And I
Yeah.
also wanted to talk about where the heck did these dietary guidelines come from? Because,
Right.
as you and I We're emailing. Like, it's bizarre. It sounds like a science fiction, it's very bizarre. And then I wanted to talk about, I don't think as dietitians, we really talk about bioavailability enough.
Hmm.
And then, of course, I've actually had a lot of people reach out to me and ask about running. As you said, I appreciate. I'm an ultra runner. I just completed my first ultra race, did a 6 hour race, and it went really well. So I'm kind of hoping that I can share my story. I can talk what it's like to be a dietitian, and Dr. Hampton, I really just want to get the discussion going. When I
Hmm.
first wrote the book, I have to admit I was really angry because I had lost my health, and we can talk a little bit
Right.
more about that. But when you lose your health, and you're just suffering, and then you transition to this way of eating, this low carbohydrate, high fat way of eating, and you get your health back, it's hard not to be like, oh my goodness, just angry at healthcare, angry at the medical industry.
That's
But then I
right.
wanted to come back and say, you know what? I want people to understand this is an option. I want anybody to be able to read this book and get it. I don't want to talk too in depth or too sciencey, but I do have over 180 clinical trials cited. So I wanted people to be able to relate. I Dr. Nevada Gray wrote the foreword, which is just beautiful.
Hmm.
Health coach Kate did the graphics, which really easy to read and to follow. So I just want to be part of the solution. I believe dietitians should be leading the way, and
They
unfortunately, I
should.
feel right now we're kind of a lot of dietitians, certainly not all dietitians, but a lot of dietitians are just kind of keeping the status quo going.
Yeah. It would be much better for me to be able to lean to my colleagues and just have them to kind of be part of the team. And although, so what I have to do now is because I don't have kind of a low carb team of dietitians, I just kind of tell them what my needs are and they honor that. They say, okay, gotcha. They know me very well by now. And so it's a matter of, okay, we know he's on a different level. So when I refer, I just make sure it has to be done this way or it's going to be mixed messages for my patients. So I really appreciate you in your field of nutrition to be one of the voices because I think that's going to really empower a lot of dietitians who really have learned some other things and they're just not sure how to approach it. And so I definitely want to piggyback and talk about the bioavailability issue. And I do appreciate that there's different layers of things you're going to touch on in the book because it may be that person with the anorexia that's going to be motivated. Maybe the person that just wants to learn more about carnivore. Maybe the person that's like really a runner and trying to figure out how to make that work, like you and Tim Noakes had to figure out. And then,
Yeah.
so I think it's really a lot of people who will benefit. But your story is a lot like mine in so many ways. I was a vegetarian for a little bit and did that for probably 8 years. And I didn't suffer while I was doing it. It just didn't. I just always felt like I was gassy. I just never felt. I was always hungry, and I knew there had to be another way. Also, the nutrition background, as you know, I'm studying to get a master's in nutrition and functional medicine. I'm a huge fan of nutrition, and I'm a huge fan of functional medicine. So I decided to get that education. And so, but like you, I found a low carb solution which helped me feel better and to achieve my goals and my patients. So tell me, what kind of took you from that vegetarian approach to this more focused on meat approach?
Yeah, so I was only a vegetarian for a relatively short period of time in high school. But I was a really high carbohydrate athlete for most of my life, and I did eat meat, but it was a very small portion of my diet. I ate mostly those quote unquote healthy whole grains. For example, I would be eating lots of oatmeal, lots of potatoes, tons of vegetables and prioritizing like vegetable proteins, eating beans and tofu and other things like that. I did eat meat. We had red meat a couple times a week, but it was pretty rare. Most of my diet consisted of those really high carbohydrate foods and fruits and vegetables. And in 2018, well, I've run 12 marathons, qualified for Boston 12 times, and I really wanted to qualify for the Olympic trials for the marathon. So to do that, you have to run a marathon for women in under 2 hours and 45 minutes. That's a 17 mile pace. And, I wanted to go all in. I didn't have any envisions of like qualifying for the Olympics. That's, not Kara Goucher, Shalane Flanagan, but usually about 250 women qualify every 4 years. So I
Wow.
was, training really hard. And all of a sudden I noticed that I wasn't recovering well from workouts. I was really sore. I was waking up in the middle of the night. I was in more pain, and I was a lot more sore compared to, how I had been, even doing similar workouts. And, I thought, oh, maybe my iron's low. I was taking iron pills. I thought, well, maybe I need more fluid. And it just, things kind of progressively over the months got worse. So I reached out to two different sports dietitians and said, hey, this is what I'm doing. These are my goals. And both dietitians said, you know what, you probably need to eat more carbohydrates. And at this point, I was eating about 350 grams of carbohydrates a day. And,
You're
both
already
people,
eating 350 and they want
350
more.
grams for your listeners to probably know that is a lot of carbohydrates.
And if you divide that by 4, that's the teaspoons of sugar. So that's a
Oh yeah,
disaster. That doesn't
that
sound
is a
good.
lot of sugar.
Oh my
And I, during this time, also I was dealing with a lot of anxiety. But I had known I've been dealing with anxiety since I was much younger, and I had just kind of embraced the idea that, like, after I'd recovered from anorexia and I would always have anxiety. I was always going to struggle with this. I was always going to obsess about food. I just kind of had to learn how to function in the world. This was going to be a difficult thing for me, and I had just kind of come to accept that. And as I was trying to qualify for the trials, okay, so 350 is not enough. I'm going to eat 400 grams. And, I'm one of those people that's really driven and motivated. So I was like, well, how about 500 grams of carbohydrates a day? So I'm eating 8 times a day, and, bananas, bagels, pasta, oatmeal. And as you can imagine, that didn't go particularly well. About a couple months of doing this, I was going out for runs and I was getting cold sweats. I went from being able to run, 10 to 15 miles at a time to struggling through a few miles. I wasn't sleeping through the night. I was waking up with my back was spasming, my legs were spasming. And so kind of the come to Jesus moment, I'll never forget this. I woke up, I had a really tough day. This is when I was still working in the hospital as acute care dietitian. Came home early, fell asleep, and I woke up about 2 in the morning, and it just felt like my legs were on fire. Like my muscles were hurting so badly. And I've had people ask me, like, what was your mileage? Were you running a lot of miles? No, I was running about 20 miles a week. So 2 in the morning, got up, drove to 7-Eleven, got 30 pounds of ice, put it in the bathtub, and sitting in an ice bath. Now it's like 2:30 in the morning, and trying to be quiet. But my wife comes in and says, maybe we should do something differently. Yeah, it was beyond time at that point to do something differently. So I
Wow.
decided at that moment that my running days were over. I would no longer run. It was taking too much of a toll on my body, on my
Mhm.
health, on my relationship. And if I wasn't going to run, then why not explore a lower carbohydrate diet? Because I intuitively know carbohydrates didn't make me feel great.
Mhm.
But I just, as a dietitian, was taught you have to have these healthy whole grains.
Right.
You have to have them. So I just intended to become a ketogenic, or follow a ketogenic diet for a short period of time. That was my
Mhm.
initial goal. Like, hey, you know what? I'm going to follow a ketogenic diet for 30 days. Let's, maybe the extra protein, less carbs will get my muscle pain under control. And then I kind of figured I'd go back to just a more, quote unquote, normal diet after that.
Right. Wow. I mean, what's funny? As I think about our education, and I just took some finals in biochemistry and gastrointestinal imbalances. Things went okay. I survived that. But man, school's a trip, so we don't have to talk about that. But anyway, um, I think about how we, are being taught, and we're going to talk more about this. Beans need grains, and grains need beans to make a complete protein. Yet they're elevating the beans and the grains. It just doesn't make sense. Like, well, if the meat has a complete protein, what are we doing? So as you're talking about that, those things come to mind. And I could imagine. Last time I saw somebody get into some ice, it was Kevin Hart with his cold as balls, thing he does, which actually is supposed to be good for longevity. Apparently, if you do this, it shocks the system, but that's another subject.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I think I'm glad you had that moment and you and your wife were able to kind of pause and say maybe a different path. So I think those moments really define us. And wow, I just love that. So I do want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of doing this. And I think about my previous guest, who we both know, which is Amber O'Hearn, and we
Oh,
did a
yeah,
YouTube
absolutely.
live. And I really love doing that YouTube live with her because I told her, let's just talk about bipolar, and how the carnivore diet helped to put that into remission. So, and by the way, I don't know if you've ever heard of Matt Jane, but Matt Jane is a neuroscientist, nutritionist, and functional medicine doc. I think he's in another country. I'm going to interview him in January because he's also one who believes that diet can actually impact your health the way we're talking about today. But he also believes that depending on your makeup, it actually can determine which diet to choose. And it'll be interesting to hear him comment on that. So we both believe, as does Amber and Matt Janes, that we need to focus on mental illness. But I know you have some history in your family with that, with your mom. So I want you to imagine, if the resources that we have today, rather it's this dietary approach or others, were available when you were a kid, how would that have impacted how you were raised as a kid? Because I know that when you have a family member with mental illness, it can make it challenging. So think about that, and think about what would be different for you.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, oh, I mean, anybody who's had a parent or a loved one that has struggled with mental illness, unfortunately, it's all encompassing, and I today have a very, very good relationship. I mean, I have a good relationship with both of my parents, but it was hard. Um, when you are consumed with mental illness, you're really not able to show up effectively in the world. Um, and when I think about this, I think about my recent health journey, and then I'll kind of speak real quickly to this, and then come back to talking a little bit more about my mom and about bipolar disorder. But like I shared earlier, I've had lifelong anxiety. I mean, since I was anorexic, so 25 years just struggled with anxiety, depression, at times suicidal ideation, engaged in some pretty severe self injury. And I think those are things we need to talk about. It's very difficult to talk about, but I appreciate, you bringing that up and bringing the conversation of mental illness up. So, when I decided I was going to follow a ketogenic diet, I, started researching what that would look like. And that is when I discovered the carnivore diet. And at first I was just shocked, like, all right, I can get behind meat, but all meat, like,
I
but
know.
I was, and like you opened this podcast up, like I did critical thinking. I said, does this make sense? And I was just shocked by how, like bioavailability. And I went all in on a carnivore diet. And my wife was not thrilled about this. We argued about this. She was worried it's restrictive, all this stuff. And
Right.
we can talk more about that. But
That's right.
eventually she was like, all right, you're an adult. You can do this. It's not going to
That's
work,
right.
whatever. And so after 3 weeks of following a diet consisting of meat, salt, and fat, and coffee, I did continue to drink coffee. Um, my wife asked me, she said, hey, can you come sit with me for a minute? And I said, sure. And she said, I'm not sure if I like this way of eating yet. This is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you.
Crazy.
So that's 3 weeks after 11 years. And so I
Three
think back to
weeks.
my mom, and, there were two things happening during the time that she was, she had, children in her early 20s. We had the low fat movement happening at that time, right?
Hmm.
So we have all this advertisement that you need to have these low fat this, low fat that. And, here my mom is dealing with this, at that time, undiagnosed mental disorder. And I think if this information had been available,
Mm.
if she had had a nutrition professional or a medical professional sit down and say, you know what, I think your brain is starving for saturated fat and amino acids.
Right.
I think you're over carbohydrating. Because now, there's Chris Palmer, the psychiatrist Chris
That's
Palmer
right.
is working. I mean, he has him and Georgia Ede have fantastic research going, and Chris Palmer's trying to get a clinical trial going right now. I mean, they're the theories about ketogenic diets that some people just can't metabolize carbohydrates and it's affecting areas of the brain, kind of like
That's right.
epilepsy, right?
Yeah.
It's not your fault. It's just a genetic or a metabolic defect.
Hmm.
So if this had been around, I think my mom would have had a much happier life. I think she would have been able to show up and be present. She is a kind and very intelligent human. I mean, she got her degree, but her anxiety and depression and bipolar mania and the opposite, exhaustion, were so crippling that she often couldn't work. She often was unavailable, and she struggled a lot with severe anxiety and also eating disorder tendencies, if not a full-blown eating disorder. So it's my hope. I do talk about my personal story in my book, and it is never my goal to blame or to shame. I mean, everything I've been through has made me the person I am, and I'm a grateful, strong, confident human. But I want people to know that there is hope and there's help. And I think it makes sense to open our minds to doing things differently.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate the idea that this only took 3 weeks, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so for anybody listening who is apprehensive, it would be highly improbable. And of course, we always have to say discuss things with your doctor and all of that kind of stuff, right? But it would be highly improbable that a 3, 4, 5 week, 2 month experiment with carnivore, keto, low carb is going to harm you. And I would even go as far as to say reverse it. If you think that if you're not vegan, you want to try, see how you feel after that. Maybe you'll feel good. I don't know. But I just know that I'm hearing success stories like this over and over again. So, and actually, while you were talking about how some people can't metabolize carbohydrates well, I was actually having a conversation with 88 Fox, the Black Carnivore, and we talked a little bit about how in communities of color there may be a bigger challenge in how we process carbs, and I just think that it's a deep conversation. So it's not just about people in general. It may be certain demographics may be more predisposed, and if that's true, it may explain why we see a higher prevalence of certain diseases in certain communities because maybe they just can't, deal with it. So, and if we have those messages that are clearly defined, it'll help us to educate that population in a slightly different way. So, but I appreciate that, and I think for you being in nutrition, it's man, you must have learned a lot of lessons as you reflect back on the work that you did previously and what you're doing now, after your education, and now you're working and you're seeing people are not getting well. So talk a little bit about your previous work in nutrition, and what setting you were in, and what lessons learned you can share with us about, as a nutrition professional, and thinking outside the box a little bit.
Yeah. So, I'm so grateful. I've had so many dietitians reach out to me lately because I do think we have this dilemma and this disconnect, right? Because, we go through education and we're taught like, this is the way to do it, high carbohydrate, lots of fiber, lots of fruits and vegetables, low fat proteins. And, as a young dietitian, as when I was going through the internship, I started to see things that, I didn't agree with. But you're young, right? You're a student. So I would ask questions, tube feeding formulas. When I was in the eating disorder treatment center getting tube fed, I was on a 24-hour tube feeding system. They haven't changed in 25 years since I was young. If when I was doing my rotation at the ICU, my dietetic rotation, you look at the ingredients on tube feeding formulas, and I would just ask questions. I would ask my preceptor and say, is it really a good idea that we're feeding these people? The first ingredient is maltodextrin, followed by corn syrup,
I
soy
know.
protein, canola oil.
Ouch.
and then we would go see a diabetic patient and I would say, I don't understand why they can have 75 grams of carbohydrates per meal, but their blood sugar is really high. Wouldn't it make more sense to have a lot less carbohydrates? And so I was immediately pegged as this, like, this Michelle
Yeah,
is this difficult dietetic student.
right.
Um, and then of course, as I continue to practice, it became very difficult because you would see patients over and over again. People come in, they would with massive infections, and people, if you haven't spent a lot of time in a hospital, it's not like we're seeing patients that are like, oh, Mary's a little overweight. I mean, we are seeing, end stage kidney failure. We're seeing, wounds down to the bone. We are seeing people that have blacked out because they took too much insulin. We're seeing, heart disease. I mean, I saw people that had strokes in their early 40s.
Mm,
So it becomes really difficult because you prescribe these guidelines and then people, they don't get better, or you might see just minimal progress. And
mhm.
often the narrative is, well, patients just are lazy and they're just not following it. Like if they just ate more fruits and vegetables, but when I was doing research for my book, what I discovered is statistically, we're actually eating more fruits and vegetables than we did in 1970, and eating a lot more whole
Yeah.
grains. We're eating less animal fat, significantly less tallow and lard and eggs, and eating a lot more oils, a lot more canola oil, olive oil, vegetable oils. So, they're actually following the guidelines.
Mm,
And we're putting people on these diets. When you have people that are required to eat lots of carbohydrates and not a lot of fat and protein, people are hungry. People are constantly hungry, and it's just like we're just basically setting people up to fail, and that's very difficult and that's frustrating. And I think a lot of I was actually thinking about this on my run this morning. I think what I've seen and what I'm really concerned about as the field of dietetics as it moves forward is, you go and you prescribe these guidelines, like, all right, you need to eat whole grains, you need to eat fruits and vegetables, and over time you see this just isn't working. But you kind of start to accept mediocrity. You're like, well, my patients aren't getting better, but I mean, this is just kind of how it is. And then,
mhm.
I've shared on other podcasts that a lot of dietitians I've worked with are either overweight or obese. And so it's like, well, it kind of
That's right.
becomes this culture of, well, that's just kind of how it is. Everything in moderation. It doesn't really work anyway. People kind of joke about it, and I'm really concerned. I'm concerned that we've started to accept that it's just normal to be obese. So, and it's just, normal to be diabetic. And if my dad had it, I'm going to have it. And, live a little bit. Everybody needs to have that ice cream. Oh, sugar addiction. Nah, that's
Mm,
just made up. We started to normalize these things,
that's right.
and we're confusing our patients.
Yeah, I think it's hard to deviate from the folk that you entrust to teach you. So uh, when I went to nutrition school, which is what I'm doing now, it's a little easier for me because I've already given myself a different lens through which I view the world. Yet, if you don't have that lens, you just assume that the people in front of you, and I mean, they're giving you 100 studies to um, tell you you should believe this approach. Yeah, but they don't necessarily tell you that it was a epidemiological study, or they may say it is an epidemiological study, but these are the only studies we have available. So we
Right.
have to go with that data. So yeah, it's very disheartening, and I know it must be difficult to not be able to help people. And it just breaks my heart that you have a person who is really passionate about helping people, and but then they struggle with weight themselves, or they struggle with anxiety and all of these things, and they have no idea that they're connected. And they're really trying to do their best. And I think that what we have to do is just keep yelling from the rooftops. We're going to get a few people to listen, a few people to listen. I mean, so I think that we'll get there. Clearly, we didn't have a low carb and a very low carb option for the ADA until recently.
Yeah.
Clearly, we didn't have the College of Cardiologists saying that fat's not the problem. We didn't have that until June of 2020. So I believe that we
Yes.
are moving the ship in the right direction. But I am a little concerned about, you think about um, Tim Noakes, who I mentioned earlier, and how he got sued, because he And he won the lawsuit, of course, but he got sued because he suggested that this keto thing or low carb thing was okay for kids, and the data supported him. But I still worry. I worry about myself. I worry about you and anybody else who's out here sharing this message. But I don't hear about clinicians losing their license often because of the dietary recommendations they make. And, so when you were actively practicing as a dietitian, do you guys have any leeway in terms of the dietary recommendations you make? Or if you deviate from the standard, is that automatically putting your license at risk? And if it does, were there any ways to ensure, like get insurance or something? Because I've seen other sites say, well, if you're teaching keto, get insurance, but I'm not sure exactly what that means. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can certainly share my experience, and I've talked to a few other dietitians. So as dietitians, you have kind of two separate I'm gonna say licenses. You become an RD, like you have to keep your RD, registered dietitian credential, and then most states require an LD, like licensed dietitian. Like I'm licensed in that state. Like for example, I have my RD that's nationally, and then I have my license for Oregon and Washington, since I
I'm glad you
practiced in both
clarified that, because I was going to ask you that question. I couldn't tell the difference. So thanks for that.
Yeah, and curiously, like not every state requires it. Like when I lived in Colorado, they didn't require an LD. But so each state has a little bit different rules and a little bit different kind of ideas on how you're kind of bound by certain things. But what I found is most hospitals have their set of things that you have to practice, and that tends to be what the registered dietetics is, the Academy of Nutrition guidelines. So I've never worked anywhere that doesn't basically say like, these are the guidelines, this is our standard of practice, this is what you have to practice.
Okay.
And so when you deviate outside of that, it opens it up to get in trouble. And obviously you're in a room with patients, and it's really challenging to see someone who's diabetic and think like your life would be so much better if you would reduce your carbohydrates.
Right.
But my guidelines say I have to tell you, this is the standard of practice. And and I am not sure. I've never had my license threatened. I've had several people tell me I could potentially have my license threatened,
Mm-hmm.
but I've never had the board or anything. Maybe that'll change when my
Right.
book comes out. We'll see.
Right. You'll get a lot of attention.
Yeah. I mean, I've been suspended twice just from the hospital setting, though. When when a nurse told my clinical supervisor that I had talked to a patient about a low carbohydrate diet. They were just struggling keeping their blood sugar stable, and they were just following this insulin regimen.
Right.
And I just presented it as an option.
Right.
That was it. I said that, this is what you've been doing. I want to talk to you about this option. And I even brought clinical trials in. I brought it to my supervisor, and I was like, no, this is not what the hospital guidelines. You're out. And then one time I had a patient in severe kidney failure who told me they would rather die than change their diet.
Mm-hmm.
And I made the mistake of saying, well, the way you're eating, you're on your way. And,
Right.
and I brought, once again, I had the clinical trials, her blood urea nitrogen and all these labs, ALT, AST were so high. But, so I think that's probably where you're going to come into more trouble. Like if you're a young dietitian or new dietitian, if you go and practice in the hospital setting and you just wanted to talk about low carb, you're probably not going to get you're a registered dietitian, your RD, in trouble, but you're probably going to get in trouble just in the hospital setting you're practicing in, just because they're going to have their set standards. That's at least my experience for that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And I'm hoping with the ADA saying a low carb and a very low carb is an option now, I think 1 of 7, that'll provide some cover and give us some more time for the rest of the world to catch up. And so it'll be interesting. But I think that documentation is going to be important. So
Yes.
any clinician out there, just, say, hey, we discussed this, and, but, you just got to be careful, because I don't want anybody to get in trouble. But at the same time, we have to help our patients, do no harm.
Yes.
Is what we learned. So let's try to live up to that. So I know when I did my research for my Fix Your Diet, Fix Your Diabetes book, and I'm so proud of you, entering the world of writing. I know for me, it was like, I'm not really a writer, but I just need to do this. So you just have to
Yep.
have the courage to do that. And I know that during the research, I learned a lot about, you know, why we eat grain so much, and going back to World War, II, and all of that stuff, and even Nixon. So I just want you to, I know you probably did the same research,
Yeah,
for your book.
absolutely.
Could you explain? Yeah, explain to the listeners, what you learned in your research as it relates to why we are consuming so many grains in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, the whole history of how our nutrition guidelines came to be and how the guidelines are is just so bizarre. But yeah, if you want to start right around World War II, uh, you know, before America, where we entered the war, we wanted to help our allies. So the government offered subsidies to farmers. Said, hey, we need you to grow more crops. We're going to give you money. And so, farmers were, pumping out more corn, more wheat. And then, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, then it was kind of like, oh, pedal to the metal. Now we really need more crops. And so we had lots of corn, we had lots of wheat. And even after the war was over, we had all this excess stuff, and the government actually tried to rescind some of those subsidies. And interestingly, some of them are still around today. Farmers obviously were like, heck no, we want to keep these. So now we had a lot of extra corn and extra wheat. But certainly at that time, in the late 40s, early 50s, we still valued high fat things, high fat milk, cheese, meats. But as time went on, you mentioned into the Nixon administration, that was a pretty turbulent time. You had the Vietnam War going on, and Nixon obviously wanted to get reelected, and so he was trying to figure out, like, okay, how can I get people on board? How can I get the public to vote for me? And one of the things he decided was like, well, how can I drive food costs down? So he hired a guy named Earl Butz, Butz. Believe it or not, I love that name. Help me out. How can we do this? And kind of the same thing, like, okay, well, let's have people grow corn. Let's grow lots of corn. We'll give them subsidies. That's going to drive the food costs down. And they did. Farmers grew tons of corn. Farmers made a lot of profit during this time, and corn started to become in everything. I mean, corn went from, just something we might have a little bit of or a little bit extra of to, we had corn oil, and we were making corn and cereals and biscuits and bread and, all this stuff. And it was like all of a sudden you had too much corn, and it was like, oh gosh, what do we do with all this extra corn? And, so Earl flew over to Japan to hear about this new technology that the Japanese had invented. And it was fascinating. It was this, you could actually take corn and you could turn it into this very sweet, goopy stuff called high fructose corn syrup. And
Oh
high
no,
fructose
don't
corn
mention
syrup,
that. Don't mention that.
it, isn't that crazy? Yeah, high fructose corn syrup was a manufacturer's, a marketer's dream because
Mm,
one, it was just as sweet as sugar. It cost two-thirds less to make than sugar, and not only did it made things taste sweet, it also extended shelf life. So here
mm,
you go. It was like, whoa, now we had a use for the corn. And at the same time, you had Ansel Keys that came out with
mm,
his 22 countries, actually only 7 countries study. So, we had the guy who Times Magazine called like nutrition scientist come out and say, oh my goodness, it's fat, saturated fat is terrible for you. It's the worst thing. It's causing heart disease. We need to eat less animal fat. So we have this message saying we need to eat less animal fat. And all of a sudden, we have all this extra corn and high fructose corn syrup. And it was kind of the perfect storm of creating, a lot of these low fat, fat free foods, but just dousing them with sugar and high fructose corn syrup.
mm. And we thought that the fructose was harmless, and now we know that it's harmful in terms of it primarily being metabolized in the liver and causing a fatty liver and a slew of other health conditions. As I listen to you share some of that historical perspective, I think about Nina Teichholz and Gary Taubes. You kind of remind me of them. You sounded like an investigative reporter, reciting, and that's what we need. And
Yeah.
the irony, you remember you said earlier, it should be nutrition people leading this. Well, it took like Gary Taubes and Nina to like kind of get us to an awakening.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but we should have nutrition people and clinical folk like myself helping to lead the charge. So we appreciate what they did to get us kind of wake us up, and now we're kind of getting on board and making sure we can share this message. So that's phenomenal. So we talked about grains, and now we know a little bit about why we have that in our in all of our foods, and obviously the high fructose corn syrup, amazing. A guy named Butts. That's just kind of funny, but whatever. So anyway, one of the pet peeves of mine is this idea that a non-essential nutrient like the grains, like high fructose corn syrup, are non-essential. Most of the all the fruits and vegetables are non-essential nutrients. But then they want to say, well, the most nutrient dense food is like things like spinach, for example, right?
Yep.
But it doesn't make sense. How could the most nutrient dense food actually be a non-essential nutrient, right? So talk to me a little bit about that, because I know you mentioned bioavailability and things like that earlier. Let's dive a little deeper and explain why maybe the carbs are not the nutrient dense foods we should focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my book, I have a chapter called Plants versus Animals, and that actually has the most works cited. I have 50,
Okay.
50 clinical trials
Oh,
in
Lord.
there
Okay.
because it's, I feel like if you ask anybody or you do a Google search, just like what's a healthy diet, you're going to get fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Like if you ask anybody on the street, most people will tell you eat your fruits and vegetables. As a
Yeah.
young dietitian, I was taught you can never get too many vegetables.
Mm-mm. Come to class with me, and that's all I hear. And again, I love what I'm learning, but I hear that over and over again.
Oh, absolutely. And it's almost a joke that like dietitians, like you can see all these stock photos with them eating their salads and big salads and you ask such an interesting question, like if it's a non-essential nutrient, how can this be the most nutrient dense foods? How can kale or spinach be superfoods? And this is something that we are not taught in nutrition, and this is I think has caused probably probably one of the biggest myths, and it's caused the most confusion. And it takes a little bit of critical thinking, but I like to tell people you want to think of the human body as a supercomputer. And the human body, just like any other species, has a species specific diet. You can you have to put the correct input in to get the correct output. I like to joke around and say, I have a small zoo going on at my house. We have 4 chickens, I've got a dog, and we have a baby tortoise. Well, the tortoise, it requires very specific greens. It can't have greens that are high in oxalates like spinach or chard. If I fed it spinach or chard, could it survive? Well, probably, but it would get very sick. And so I guess I could feed it spinach and chard and then give it lots of medications and it would just kind of live this subpar turtle life. Well, why wouldn't I just feed it the things that its body's meant to have? So that's kind of my lead into bioavailability. What bioavailability means is it's what can your body actually use and process, okay? And spinach is such a great example. If spinach has 6 milligrams of iron per cup, but my body can only utilize 1.7% of that. That would be the equivalent, Dr. Hampton, of me writing you a
Yeah,
check for $1,000 and then you go to cash it and I've got $17 in my bank account. Like,
that's right. I'll be
you're going to
looking
be
for
real
you.
disappointed. And if we can't use it, it is not effective.
Right.
Animal nutrition, liver, meat, our body is able to utilize all those things incredibly well. They have, and a lot of people think, oh, meat, it's just protein. It's just, but no, meat is not just protein. It's zinc, it's B12, it's carnosine, it's taurine. It has all those cofactors, vitamins, and minerals that work synergistically in the body, meaning they all work together to make your body and your brain function correctly. And that's one of my theories why a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet is so incredibly effective because you're putting in all that nutrition, but you're also removing a lot of the other things.
That's right.
When we don't talk about, I was severely anemic in 2011, and I was taking a ton of iron supplements, and I was even
Mhm.
eating meat at that point. But I was eating so much things like oats, that in seeds that have something called phytates or phytic
That's
acid. Well, what does
right.
that do? That binds to calcium and iron.
Yeah.
So we're putting these things in our body that are basically, not only maybe don't have the nutrition our body can absorb, but they're preventing our body from absorbing other nutrition.
Mm.
So bioavailability is simply meaning or even species specific diet, let's eat in a way that we're going to get the most nutrition and cause the least harm. And in my experience as a, 11 years a dietitian, getting my health back, like I said, I went from not being able to run to I won my first 6 hour ultra marathon to all the clinical trials I reviewed is that way of eating is an animal based, high fat, very low carbohydrate diet.
It's funny. Um, we were we were taught bioavailability in this gastrointestinal imbalances class, but it's ironic because so I knew um, that spinach had iron and calcium, but you couldn't really use it as often, get as much out of it, right? But see,
Mhm.
but it's how it's framed. So it's almost like, so you will, yes, you don't get as much out of it, but the overall benefits are greater than you eating animal products. That's
Interesting.
how it's framed.
Yeah.
So what happens is there's so much fear of saturated fat, which we clearly know that's not a problem because the College of Cardiology is finally catching up, and we knew it before they even said it publicly. I think they knew it too, but that's another subject for another day. And so I think that the belief systems are so ingrained in you got to have fruits and vegetables, and even when you have data in front of you that says you're not going to get the nutrient out of it, it's like it's kind of overlooked. And it's just I just thought about that as you articulated your message, that's so we have to be able to think critically and think outside the box. And if we get everybody on the vegan side and the carnivore side to do that, then we can look at data with an open eye. So another thing that was funny is when you mentioned 4 chickens, I just had to chuckle. And I know you did a podcast with Jimmy Moore. Did he tell you
Yep.
he has chickens too?
Yeah, yeah, he's got chickens. We talk about our
Oh my
goofy
God,
chickens, yeah.
you guys are killing me. So you bringing that whole Texas thing. So I love it. So I'm a city boy, so I'm not familiar with. I see my chicken in the grocery store, but I think that's really cool that you and Jimmy are leading the charge there. So it's kind of cool. So I do want to also ask you. Let's shift a little bit. I'm a big fan of helping people with mental health, and so I want to just ask you a little bit about anxiety and what it means to you. Like the symptoms you experienced and how those symptoms impacted you. Because the message I'm trying to share with this question is if you do that little 3 or 4 week experiment, it could change your life. So I just want you to speak to when you did that experiment and your wife came to your side and said, you're a different person than you were 3 weeks ago. I want to hear more about that whole concept of how that improved your life.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. For me, anxiety, and I shared a little bit earlier, especially after suffering, from an eating disorder. Once I was weight restored, I was told like, hey, you're always gonna have racing, obsessive thoughts around food. And I feel like that ruled my day. From the time I got up, I would be thinking, okay, what am I going to eat today? Oh, is this too much? Oh, is this not enough? And I would sometimes feel kind of dizzy and shaky. Often I would open the refrigerator and just stare. Like, I don't know, how is that going to make me feel? Oh no, yeah, you really struggle just like being calm and being present. I would often, I wouldn't go to social situations because I was afraid. I would have panic attacks in group if there were too many people gathering. If I was at work, sometimes I couldn't focus. I'd see a patient and I'd have to go sit at a computer, do some deep breathing. I felt like my mind was racing. I couldn't sleep well. Um, Often felt like I was short with my family, my wife. Um, Incredibly critical on myself. Everything I did was never good enough. If I did something even great, I'd win a race or something, I would come back and be like, oh, I could have done this or that. I was constantly judging, thinking, criticizing, overanalyzing, to the point where it's paralyzing. There were times when, I couldn't go to work or I would just be so upset or so wound up. that I couldn't function, and for most of my life, I was able to manage it to the point where I may be like a high functioning individual with anxiety. I still worked, I still ran, I still, obviously had relationships, but it affected every aspect of my life. So, after, like you said, those few weeks, I noticed after about the second week, I started to feel really calm. Like it was this really strange feeling. Like I'd drive to work and I would just be kind of listening to the radio and thinking like happy thoughts. And I wasn't so hungry. I'd eat at 8 and then I used to be hungry at 9:30 or 10, but I would eat and I'm like, oh, I'm full. Like I'll never forget. I was in a meeting. All the dietitians were in a meeting, and my coworker was like sitting right next to me and she's kind of tapping her fingers and she's looking at me and she's like, I'm gonna sneak out and get a snack. Do you want something? And I was like, no, I'm gonna eat. We'll eat at like noon, right? And she goes, Michelle, it's almost 2. And I was like, whoa. Like that never would have happened in any universe. Once I was able to eat meat and fat and have my, blood sugar stable. And now, of course, I understand like the impact that was having on my neurotransmitters, my brain chemistry. It basically just shifted everything. Like I was able to be calm. I was able to show it for my patients. I'm able to show it better in my relationship. I've noticed I have more positive self-talk even when I'm running. I'll say things
Mhm.
like, "Come on, Michelle, you got this. You got it, girl."
Mhm.
Where like I never did, I never did that before. I
Yeah.
was so critical. So it basically, it all these things you hear, you if you're trying to do some self-help or whatever, like, positive thinking, I was able to actually take that and actually implement it. It started like showing up in my life when I started transitioning, the foods I was putting in my body.
Wow. Um, that's amazing. By the way, you'll be so proud of me. I have some steak. I made a whole lot of steak yesterday. So for lunch, my lunch will occur after we finish our interviews. It's for those
Nice.
who would know, it's 1 p.m. Chicago time for me. And I'm just not hungry.
Mm,
I'm just not hungry. And it's what a good feeling. And even the mental clarity it takes to interview you and have this conversation, it's just there. If I had had like a 12 o'clock lunch or something, like a Subway sandwich with some chips and some soda, this would be like work, instead it just feels easy. So I am really so happy to be doing a similar thing like yourself. But man, nobody wants their clinician, rather it's their doctor, pharmacist, their nutrition professional, to feel the way you described or to react the way you described. We really want to live in a world where we're able to. I just recently saw how Tom Cruise reacted to his team related to someone not wearing a mask, and I'm not suggesting he was doing it because of his diet, but maybe he just reacted because he doesn't have a diet that allows his mind to be level. So the impact that it has in fact, some of those people I think decided to leave the organization.
mm,
So we really want to be able to treat people with dignity and respect and all of that. And I guess it makes me now think about the other health condition you've struggled through, which is anorexia nervosa. And I was curious, similar kind of question, but more on the lines of when you have that kind of condition, as I think I recall in a previous interview, you said it really made you sick. So tell me a little bit about why that condition is so dangerous.
Oh, certainly. I mean, anorexia, has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness. I believe
I
I'd
didn't
have
even
to,
know that. I don't
yeah,
think I knew that. That's amazing.
yeah, it
Wow.
does. When I have a whole chapter on eating disorders, and I think I'm prepared for some pushback on this because, unfortunately, a lot of the dogma around eating disorders is, oh, we have to be able to eat all foods and all foods fit. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But, with anorexia, the features are, you're going to maintain a lower than normal body weight. You tend to lose weight. You're, obsessed about food, tracking calories. And that was what my entire life revolved around when I was very young. I was tracking calories, starving myself. At that point too, I was losing a lot of weight. And curiously, during that time, it'll be really difficult to understand if you've never experienced it. But I started to struggle with severe body dysmorphia. I was losing weight and I could actually touch my ribs, but I'd look in the mirror and I would see a much larger person, and it was terrifying. And as I was doing research, for the book, it was really interesting to see that, I guess interesting isn't probably the right word, but probably disheartening to see that, with anorexia, um, a lot of the people who pass away from anorexia, it's not even because of the health complications. Certainly people do die or pass away because, their weight is too low, their body can no longer support them. But a lot of individuals commit suicide. They just, it gets too much. It's too much to live in this cycle of constantly starving yourself. So yeah, that was it was a really dark, really scary place. And
Mm.
the treatment is just same treatment for every other disease. It's the standard
Mhm.
American diet. And which I make a note in my book that I think, if the ultimate goal is to save your life, there might be times when a really high carbohydrate or higher calorie approach, regardless of what it is the best thing. Like if you're, we're going to keep you alive is number one. But I think for long-term success, I think we really need to ask ourselves, is feeding somebody, this in this standard American diet that can potentially cause issues with your body and brain? Like, is that really a great idea?
Right. And it's man, I just think that the beauty of it is that it fixes a lot of things. And a lot of my previous guests, they weren't necessarily being treated for anxiety, depression, but that was kind of like the side effect of them going low carb or keto or carnivore. So it's pretty amazing. And anxiety can lead to suicide. Anorexia can lead to suicide. And when I talked to Dr. Paul Deschamps, who was a previous podcast guest. He told me that 300 to 400 docs die every year because of suicide, and it's probably going to be worse in 2020 because of COVID. And so I
Yeah.
decided to look up the suicide rates by industry and occupation. And I found that the industries with the highest suicide rate were in agriculture, forestry, mining, and construction. While from an occupation perspective, it was in management, which I totally understand because I think
Yeah.
about my manager, uh, Yolanda Young, who works in my site, my clinical site, the things she has to deal with. But they also mentioned business, finance, and those in computers. So my thought is, with so many nutrition professionals struggling to help their patients achieve their health-related goals because they have to follow these guidelines, which are outdated. And I know we have some new guidelines coming up very shortly. My assumption is that beyond the things we've talked about, that's going to put them at risk for depression, anxiety, and possibly even suicide because they can't help people. So what's your thoughts on that reality and the frustrations that the dietitians are facing?
Yeah, absolutely. I alluded it to a little earlier. I think you only have two choices. You either have to fall in line and just decide that mediocrity is the way to go, that nobody's meant to be healthy and that this is just how it is, and here we go. We're just gonna, check boxes and get insurance reimbursement and continue to see people be ill. Or, like you said, we critical think and we say this isn't working. There's a better way. But then you're bound by these guidelines. So I've had several dietitians reach out to me and say, like, I hear you, I'm with you. I'm so frustrated by how things are going. And I know a lot of nutrition professionals leave. They leave dietetics and do something else just because
Yeah,
they just can't, like myself, like we just can't keep seeing this cycle. Like you said, our first premise is do no harm. And I felt like I was doing harm by continuing to be in a system that was prescribing these guidelines. So I I worry about that, and I like you talked about with mental health. My only two goals in life, like I think everybody should chase their passions and help others. And
right.
when you eat in a way that aligns with human physiology, everything changes. When your anxiety is, or when your energy is level and you're not anxious and you're feeling good, you get to show up in the world effectively. So when you do that, it's like I couldn't. Once you get your health back, you can't really go back,
Mhm.
and you could become
Yeah,
so frustrated with the system. So I do worry about that. And I do worry, we have data. I mean, especially Georgia Ede has presented some great research that, when we're eating a lot of carbohydrates and a lot of seed oils, it can actually prevent our brain from engaging in neuroplasticity. What does that mean? Our brain can actually mold and change and cope with stress.
Right.
So, I mean, anybody listening to this has been a really stressful year. And I don't anticipate the next year's, especially the beginning of next year, is going to be a lot less stressful. And
Hmm.
what do people do? I mean, most people, when they're when they're stressed, it's like, well, let's go eat more carbs and sugar. So it's like
Right.
we're setting ourselves up to be more stressed, to have less coping, and to keep our brain and body inflamed.
That's
So
right.
I hear you, and I share your concern that I think we're going to see, unfortunately, we're going to see more suicides. We're going to see more anxiety and more depression. And that's why I'm so grateful for you and your advocacy, because I want to be part of the solution. I want to help
Mhm.
lead the way and offer hope and help. And I love that you made a point to say this, because I think it is important that it doesn't take, in my experience and the people I've talked to and interviewed, this way of eating, it doesn't take, 6 months or a year to feel the difference. It might take a long time if you have a lot of health problems to completely
Mhm.
reverse those. But you can start to have more mental clarity and less anxiety in days,
Yeah,
weeks.
fairly
So,
quickly. Yep, it's pretty amazing. I've heard Dr. Eric Westman talk about how you get past a little pain in the beginning and it's like a beautiful thing after that. So
yep.
huge, huge kudos to all of that because that's absolutely true. So, but yeah, I think we have a purpose. We're here we can't wait. We can't wait. We have to do this work now. People are dying. People need to get this message out. I love my health system, but I can't wait for them. We're working on a weight management program, which I think will make a huge difference, but I still can't wait. I started doing this before we start working on a weight management program. I can't wait for the nutritional guidelines to change because guess what? The ones that are coming out, they're still not going to be right. They're not going to be right. Shout out to the Nutrition
You and
Coalition
I might
and
be dead before they're updated. We can't
exactly.
wait.
So everybody should know about Nutrition Coalition. They're fighting tooth and nail. They're just fighting to make a change. So if you haven't heard about Nina Teichwitz and the Nutrition Coalition, look them up. You should support them because they're really helping to support us. So I thought about you being the opposite of a previous guest, and that was Dr. Terry Mason. He went from being a butcher to a vegan, while you went from being a vegetarian to going into butchery. So
Yeah, yeah.
tell me a little bit about that. That when I learned of that, that was funny to me. So when you are processing meat, why do you feel that that's a sweet spot for you, where you feel at home?
Yeah. So, when after I left healthcare and was working on writing the book, I knew whatever I did next, I wanted it to be something that mattered and something I could kind of get behind. And, also, unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of hiring, a lot of jobs happening. And my wife and I we buy cow share. We buy from a regenerative farmer about 75 minutes away. And so we often get these, a lot of cuts of meat that are tougher, and so we got just this little grinder, and I would grind the meat with the fat, and I always just felt really connected to the animal. Like, oh, this is so great! I'm honoring the animal by using all the meats, and our dog gets the bones, and we're making soups and stocks. And it felt really good. It felt like it just kind of like connecting and healing. And so, when an opportunity came up for a small, kind of local place in Portland, Oregon, hey, we're looking for someone to help break down animals. We make sausages, we grind meats. I thought like, yeah, that would be such a neat opportunity. That's something I've never done. Certainly not on a professional level. And I just found it was everything I could hope for. It was getting to meet local farmers, getting to see different cuts of animals, like, and also, we separating hearts and livers and just using everything and just being able to give back to the community. I felt like it was kind of like an act of gratitude too. Like, hey, we're selling these. This is good for you. This is good for your family. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to me. Like, I never really thought about food like that. I feel like we're so separated from our food. Most of us just go to a grocery store, get things, and come back, versus like getting to actually get out there and see the animals or see the process of breaking down meat. So yeah, for me, it was really neat. It just kind of felt like an additional part of my healing.
Yeah, it sounds like you found your purpose in that work. You found your purpose in the work you're working on with the book and obviously the things you're doing with podcasting, social media. So would that be an accurate statement that you're finding your purpose through all of these vehicles?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm also finding is just all these limits that I put on myself. I kind of wonder this, when you lose your health, you start to just be like, well, you stop dreaming, I mean, I had just decided like, well, I'm not going to run again. Like that dream is over. That had been my dream since college, to try to run competitively and elite. And, when you get your health back, you kind of, you just start to dream, like what's possible. And I just can't even describe like how grateful I am and how hopeful I am for the future. And yeah, I just hope that we can keep getting the message out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll ask my classic question in a moment, but I do want to allow you to, if you have any additional thoughts about your book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. I know you touched on the different folk who may benefit from it. Those who run, those who are looking to understand this whole historical thing. But anything like for those who are listening, who are thinking about for the new year, what to purchase to get them on point. What would you say the take home message about your book would be that they should consider?
Yeah, I think my book offers an alternative option, and what you're not going to see from dietitians or most dietitians. Certainly, there are some people that are starting to talk about a ketogenic approach, but I think a lot of people will say like, oh, there's so much fear mongering around low carbohydrate, right? Like you alluded to about saturated fat. Like, oh, it's bad for your heart, or oh, it's highly restrictive, or oh, it's a fad diet. But if your health is suffering, or if you just don't have consistent energy, or you're just curious, or maybe your mom or your dad or your grandma, someone has diabetes. I mean, we know that 70% of our country is overweight or obese, and 88% have some type of metabolic dysfunction. This is just going to give you information. Like, I mean, everybody's an adult. I've said on other podcasts, like, I have no stock in this. You guys are welcome to eat however you want, but I think everybody needs to understand the option and to understand like there is a different choice and there's a better way that can completely shift your quality of life. So I just want people to know that, and I hope it's a relatively easy read. I didn't want to make it too complicated or too technical. I have lots of resources if people are curious and want to dive deeper. But yeah, it would be my goal that when you're finished, you're like, wow, like you just have hope.
Mhm.
And I also, it was really important for me to have kind of like a call to action, because I know, I know I've read books before, and then you're like, okay,
Yeah, what do you do
now
now?
what? Now what do I
Right.
do? Right?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is cool. I don't know what to do. And so obviously I have a getting started chapter in there, but I wanted to give people like, this is a health coach that can help you. This is a ketogenic dietitian ready to help you. This is, obviously, you're in my book. Dr. Cyrus is a people that give you someone to reach out to, because there are going to be some people that read the book that are like, I got this, I'm going. There are going to be some people that are like, I need help. I want a health coach, or I need someone to, and I'm all in on coaches. I've been running for 20 years. I have a coach. I think accountability is important. So yeah, I mean, that would be another thing is there's people today ready to help you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I just want to really drive that home because I think people need to know what their options are, and we just need, but I like that inspiration piece and just providing clarity. So love that. And I guess the same, thoughts for yourself in terms of what you need to do for 2021. And I always ask about my NEST and my ROPE acronym. And so when you think about the NEST and the ROPE acronym, which deals with things like nutrition, exercise, et cetera, what part of your life will be your focus over the next year?
Yeah, this next year it's funny because my wife and I were reflecting on this past year, and even though there've been so many difficult things, there's also been a lot of positive things. So this next year, I'm going to continue with my running goals. Certainly, my exercise. I have a 100K, so a 62-mile race in April, and then hopefully a 50-mile race in October. So those are going to be two things that are really big for me. And then, certainly continuing this advocacy, is going to be really important for me. As far as my nutrition goes, I am always I'm open to learn, to grow, to evolve, and to change. Obviously I believe in this way of eating. And I think if we all started at this foundation, right, this foundation of meat and fat, but I also think it's really important to be open. Certainly my nutrition shifts as my running shifts. Yeah, I mean, those are the two of the biggest things personally. And, I want to continue to be able to give back. I hopefully, if the book is successful, I would love to help Chris Palmer. Chris Palmer wants to do a ketogenic clinical trial on
Mhm.
bipolar disorder and
Yeah,
on mental illnesses. And, obviously running clinical trials is incredibly expensive. So,
yeah.
it's my hope to be able to donate a portion of all the book sales to that.
I love
So
that.
yeah, and just continuing my own mental health. So continuing practices of gratitude and journaling. Um, yeah, those are kind of the big things that I'm focusing on this year, and we'll just see what other opportunities come up.
Well, thank you. And yeah, Chris Palmer, I definitely need to get him on the podcast at some point to talk about this topic. So I'll look into that.
Cool.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up, and of course, make sure people know how to reach out to you. So what's the best way for people to find you?
Yeah. So hopefully by the time this podcast comes out later this next week, I'm going to have my website up. It is the dietitiansdilemma.net, and there should be a link to pre-order the book on there.
Nice.
I'm very active on Instagram. So, like you said, run, eat, meet, repeat, which is kind of the story of my life, which I'm
Right.
grateful and I love. But yeah, run, eat, meet, repeat. I am on Twitter. I don't argue with people on Twitter, so I don't really engage, but I do post occasionally on Twitter. Michelle Hurn, HURNRD. So run, eat, meet, repeat on Instagram. Michelle Hurn RD on Twitter, and the dietitiansdilemma.net.
Excellent. Looking forward to all of that. And wow, just I'm excited for you, and thank God we have you out there. So thank you, Michelle, for joining us today. And for those who want a little bit more, I will share in the show notes a YouTube live I'll be doing with Michelle where we discuss Michelle's plans for the holidays and how she's going to survive the holidays,
Yeah.
low carb, keto, or carnivore. So thank you again, Michelle.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. So, sometimes guys, life experiences, um, they help us to see the world through the lens of negativity. But to be honest with you, we need to start thinking outside the box a little bit. And what we need is we need people to motivate and encourage us to take a different path, to see things differently. My hope as we prepare for the holidays and the new year is that Michelle Hurn will serve as your virtual gift, a gift that will help prepare you for the new year and to think positively. And for some of you, it's the gift of inspiration. For others, it will just be it's a loving nudge that you needed to push you towards the actions you'll need to work towards your ideal state. And, protecting your nest only requires daily and continuous improvement. It's what I learned from Dr. Jen Unwin and her husband, Dr. David Unwin, when they taught me about the GRIN acronym, where the I represents incremental change. By doing that, you will find a better version of yourself each and every day. I thank each of you, for giving me the gift of your ears and maybe a piece of your heart. And I promise to keep giving you the gift of great guests to help us all along our way. So as we conclude, I only ask that you safely enjoy the holidays. Of course, get vaccinated if appropriate. I plan to get my vaccine on Wednesday. Be well, and of course, continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.